All right, so we've got this story about HeLa cells, and we've got all this stuff to go through: scientific papers, bios, even some excerpts from the book "The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks." Seems like a real medical marvel, but maybe some iffy origins.
Well, the really interesting thing here is how these immortal cells changed. They really shaped scientific progress. But the ethical questions, right? It's like this balancing act between these amazing discoveries and, the rights of a person.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's break it down first off.
Yeah.
Who was this Henrietta Lacks?
So Henrietta Lacks, she was this young African-American woman living in Virginia in the 1950s. And sadly, she passed away from cervical cancer.
Okay.
But they took a sample of her tumor, and they did it without her knowledge or consent, and this is how we got HeLa cells. The first human cell line that didn't die, that could multiply forever outside the body.
Wait, so they just like didn't die? How does that even happen?
Yeah, right. So most cells, they have like a set lifespan. You can think of it like those little plastic tips on your shoelaces. Every time a cell divides, the telomeres, those are the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, they get a little shorter.
Okay.
And eventually they just get too short and the cell dies. But with HeLa cells, they can keep those telomeres long.
So they don't die.
Yeah. So they just keep on dividing.
So they found the fountain of youth, but for cells, that's crazy.
Right.
So what happened? Did they just like sit in the lab somewhere, these immortal cells?
No, not at all. HeLa cells became like this sensation, a scientific sensation. Jonas Salk, he used them to make the polio vaccine back in 1954.
Oh, wow.
And they were key to that because unlike other cells, you can grow tons of HeLa cells and you could infect them with the polio virus. And that let Salk test his vaccine, really well.
Wow. So HeLa cells, they actually like directly helps to get rid of one of the most terrifying diseases of the 20th century. I remember my grandparents talking about like how scary polio was back then.
Right.
What other breakthroughs did HeLa cells help with?
Well, so think about like the early days of space travel. Scientists, they had no idea how human cells would react to zero gravity, right?
Yeah.
So guess what they did? They sent HeLa cells into space.
Really?
So this helped them to see, like, what space travel does to human biology.
They're like little tiny astronaut pioneers. It's just amazing to think how just one woman's cells have had such a big impact on so many different areas of research.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
For sure. And they were also a huge part of developing those first anti-cancer vaccines, specifically for cervical cancer, the very disease that took Henrietta Lacks' life.
That's kind of ironic.
It is.
When you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
But amazing at the same time.
Totally. And the research that they're using HeLa cells for, it's ever expanding. Over 70,000 studies and counting.
Wow.
They've used them to study HIV/AIDS, to map genes, even to test out like the effects of makeup and cosmetics.
It's amazing how much they've been used for decades now, these HeLa cells. But I can't help but think, wasn't it a big ethical problem to take her cells without her consent?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And back in the 1950s, like informed consent, the way we know it today, it wasn't really standard practice.
Right.
Henrietta and her family, they had no idea. They didn't know that her cells were being used, and they definitely didn't know anyone was profiting off of them. And this really set off this huge debate about patients' rights, like who owns this biological material.
I can imagine for the family to find out, like, oh, your mother's cells are literally fueling a scientific revolution, and you had no idea.
Yeah.
That must have been really hard to deal with.
Yeah.
So what happened when they did find out?
Well, it was like in the 1970s that they first heard about these HeLa cells. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Just the shock, the anger. They felt betrayed and exploited. It took years, and I mean years of fighting and legal battles before they got some saying control over how Henrietta's cells were used and to finally get some recognition for what she gave to science.
So it's not just this scientific story, it's a human story.
Yeah.
With like so many layers to it. I mean, we've talked about how HeLa cells came to be and their impact on science, but there's a lot more to talk about, right? About the ethical side of things and the family's fight to be recognized.
Yeah.
It's something we should really dig into more.
Absolutely. Understanding the science is just the first step.
Right.
The ethical side of things and the impact on the Lacks family, that's the real heart of this whole thing.
Okay, so we know HeLa cells are special, but what is it about them, like genetically, that makes them different? What makes them immortal when other cells aren't?
Well, one thing is they have this unusual number of chromosomes. Like most human cells have 46, but HeLa cells, they've got between 76 and 80.
Whoa, extra chromosomes. That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, it does. It's partly because of the cancer, the original cells were
Oh,
cancerous,
huh.
and partly because of this HCV human papillomavirus DNA that's inside them.
Okay.
The virus kind of messed up the cells, hijacked the machinery so they grow out of control and end up with these extra chromosomes.
So it's like this perfect storm of things that created these scientific superstars.
You're right.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about like where they came from and how they changed the world,
Mm,
but it also makes you think about how this all happened without Henrietta Lacks even knowing.
yeah.
So how did the medical community react when the family found out about HeLa cells?
Well, at first, there wasn't really any recognition, any compensation.
Right.
It wasn't until the 1970s, more than 20 years after Henrietta passed away, that the Lacks family even knew about HeLa cells
Wow.
and that they were being used so widely. And this is really what got people talking about, the ethics of it all and the family's privacy.
They must have felt so betrayed. Like all of a sudden you find out that your mother's cells have been used in all these studies
Yeah.
and you had no idea.
Exactly. Exactly.
It took a lot of advocacy, a lot of legal battles for them to get some control right
Yeah. Yeah. It took years.
over how Henrietta's cells were being used
Yeah.
and to be recognized, like to have her contribution to science be acknowledged.
Yeah.
So what did they actually do? Did they like file a lawsuit?
Yes, there have been a few over the years, kind of chipping away at all the legal and ethical stuff surrounding these HeLa cells.
Uh-huh.
One of the big ones was back in 2021 against Thermo Fisher Scientific. They're this big company that makes and sells HeLa cells.
Wow. So it's like a David versus Goliath, a family taking on this huge
Yeah.
biotech company.
Yeah, for sure.
What were they hoping to get from that?
Well, they said that Thermo Fisher was making all this money off of Henrietta Lacks cells without her consent.
Right.
And without giving the family a dime. They wanted some money, like reparations, and they wanted more control over how HeLa cells were being sold and used commercially.
That makes sense. It's not just about the money, though, is it? It's about acknowledging that Henrietta Lacks and her family deserve something for what her cells have done for science,
Yeah.
And the profits that have come from them.
Yeah.
Did they win?
Well, they settled in 2023, but the details are still kind of hush-hush, confidential.
Oh, okay. So we don't know the specifics, but a settlement's a win, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It says, hey, the family had a real claim here.
It definitely set a precedent,
Uh-huh.
and it was a wake-up call for scientists and biotech companies that they can't ignore these ethical issues with HeLa cells.
Right.
Like, you can't just profit off someone's cells without thinking about the person those cells came from.
Right. That's like a reminder that science can't just steamroll over individual rights and people's dignity.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of HeLa cells, they're known for contaminating other cell cultures. How big of a problem is that?
HeLa contamination has been a real pain for researchers, for decades.
Yeah.
They're so good at growing and taking over, they can really mess up your data, waste a ton of time and resources. Imagine you spend months on this experiment and it's all useless because HeLa snuck in there.
That sounds horrible. So how do scientists even try to prevent that?
It takes a lot of really careful work, super strict lab procedures.
No.
They need special equipment just for HeLa cells. They got to keep things sterile and test other cell lines constantly to make sure HeLa hasn't contaminated them.
So it's like a constant battle to keep these cellular renegades in check.
It can be, but the good thing is scientists have learned from it.
Uh-huh.
It's made lab standards tougher and everyone's way more aware of contamination.
So it's not just scientific discoveries. It's like they've forced us to be better at research, more careful.
That's a good way to put it.
So HeLa cells haven't just pushed science forward. They've made us better at doing science, too.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. HeLa's impact goes way beyond just the discoveries.
Right.
The whole story has made us rethink how we do things, like our ethical responsibilities.
It really is amazing. We've talked about the ethical issues and the contamination problem, but what about the family's fight for recognition?
Yeah.
Like, what have been some of the big wins for them?
Well, the Lacks family story is one of incredible perseverance. They've been fighting for decades to get Henrietta Lacks recognized for what she did for science.
It's easy to forget that behind these scientific breakthroughs, there's a real human story, a family that deserves to be acknowledged and respected. So what kind of recognition have they gotten?
Well, there's been a real push to honor her and make sure her story isn't forgotten.
Uh-huh.
Back in 1996, the Morehouse School of Medicine started this annual HeLa Women's Health Conference. in her honor.
Oh, well.
And in 2010, Johns Hopkins, where her cells were taken, started the Henrietta Lacks Memorial Lecture Series to recognize her impact.
It's good to see that institutions are doing something to honor her legacy, but what about the public? Do people know her story?
Well, awareness has grown a lot, thanks in part to Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Right.
It's really good, like really good investigative journalism,
Mhm.
and it brings together the science of HeLa with the story of her family.
I've heard great things. Got to add it to my list.
Oh, you should. And there's been this push to get her into the National Women's Hall of Fame,
Yeah.
which she totally deserves. And a lot of places have created scholarships and grants in her name, so her legacy will live on in future scientists.
Sounds like, despite all the injustice, Henrietta Lacks is finally getting recognized.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It really shows the power of her story and her family's dedication.
For sure, their whole journey shows how important it is to fight for what's right. Science can't overshadow the people who make it happen.
It really speaks to those core values of medical ethics, respect, autonomy, justice.
Exactly.
So even though there might still be legal stuff going on, Henrietta Lacks' name isn't just some footnote anymore.
Right.
She's being seen as this key figure in medical research, and her family's fight has set a precedent for patient rights and informed consent.
Absolutely. It reminds us that behind every discovery, every breakthrough, there are human stories that need to be heard
Right.
and respected. And sometimes they make us rethink those ethical boundaries and try to build a fairer system for everyone.
It's been really eye-opening talking to you about all of this. I mean, we've gone through so much. The amazing discoveries made possible by HeLa cells, to the ethical mess, and the Lacks family struggle for recognition. It's a story that really sticks with you.
It is. Yeah, it is.
It seems like we're still figuring out some of those questions that Henrietta Lacks' story brought up.
For sure.
Okay, so we've explored this incredible journey of HeLa cells from their, well, controversial beginning to how they've changed science and medicine.
Mm-hmm.
But Henrietta Lacks' story also brings up these bigger questions about the future of research. What are some of those legal battles that are still going on with HeLa cells, and what are the main issues being debated?
It's like Henrietta Lacks' case opened this whole Pandora's box, right?
Yeah, it really did. What are some of those issues that people are debating now?
Well, one of the big ones is ownership. Like, who controls this genetic information? We can map out a whole genome now.
Right.
But then the question is, who owns that data?
Especially in this case, like her cells have been used everywhere, even sold. It's hard to know where to draw the line.
Exactly. Like, does the family have any say in how her genetic info gets used? Should they get something when companies are making money from her cells, basically from her DNA? These are the questions that courts and lawmakers are trying to figure out.
It's like the rules haven't caught up with the science.
Yeah, we need some clear rules about who owns and can use this genetic information, especially when it comes to these cell lines that came from someone.
Uh-huh.
Henrietta Lacks' case really brought these issues to light,
It did.
made us face them head on.
And I bet it gets even more complicated when you think about those genetic databases and biobanks where people donate their DNA for research.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, when someone gives their DNA, are they saying it's okay to use it for anything?
Right.
What if researchers find out something totally unexpected, like someone's got a gene that makes them more likely to get a disease? Who should know about that?
It's not just like a what if either. This
Right.
stuff has real consequences for people.
Exactly. We got to make sure people really understand what they're agreeing to when they give their DNA and that their privacy is protected. I mean, we've come a long way from the 50s, but there's still so much to do to make sure medical research is ethical and respects people.
It's a reminder that science isn't just happening in a bubble. It's connected to ethics in real people's lives.
Henrietta Lacks' story really shows us that her legacy is still shaping how we think about using human biological stuff. It's a cautionary tale, Like, yeah, we got to push science forward, but we can't forget about the people who make it all possible.
Well, this has been amazing. Thank you for explaining all this about HeLa cells, their impact, and all the ethical questions. It's definitely a story that stays with you.
It's been my pleasure, I think. The story of Henrietta Lacks and these HeLa cells, it shows us that science isn't just about data and findings. It's about people.
Right.
It's about their lives, their stories, and how what we do affects them.
And to everyone listening, keep learning about this story. Keep talking about the future of medical research and how we use human biological material ethically. Henrietta Lacks' story is a reminder. It's a call to action to make sure we're doing science the right way, with respect, transparency, and a commitment to people's well-being.
Don't forget, knowledge is most powerful when it comes with ethics and respect for the people behind the science.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and dive deep into the world around you.